Hi, I'm Sam Edith.
And I'm Amy Nelson. Welcome to What's Her Story with Sam and Amy.
This is a show about the world's most remarkable women, their professional and personal journey.
Together, we'll hear from gold medalists, best-selling authors, and leaders of the world's most iconic brands.
Listen every Thursday or join the conversation anytime on Instagram at What's Her Story Podcast. Minda Harts is the founder of the Memo, a career development company for women of color. She's the best-selling author of 2 books and the host of a weekly career podcast for women of color. In 2020, she was named LinkedIn's top voice for equity in the workplace. Well, Minda, thank you so much for joining us. We have so many questions for you, and we want to make sure that we finish everything by 10, so we'll just jump right in.
Okay.
Amy, you go ahead.
Okay, I'll just dive right in. I always feel weird with the first question. So, Minda, at what point did you stop trying to work within the system and start trying to change the system?
Yeah, that's a great question, Amy. You know, it's funny because I didn't know I could work outside the system. I thought that I had to continue to try to figure out how to work within it. And then I realized that I had this epiphany that the system was never created for me to succeed. And I could try as much as I want, but the system is just not created for that. And so I had to disrupt that system in order to get what I needed to no longer just thrive, but to survive, or I'm sorry, not to survive in the workplace, but to thrive. And so it took me about 10 years to figure out that this system was not going anywhere and that I was going to have to do something differently.
What was the specific incident that really pushed you to leave your position and make this change?
Yeah, well, I spent 15 years in corporate America, and I stayed at one place for about 10 years, and that was the only thing I kind of knew, but I realized that wasn't the best, right? So I thought, okay, well, I know what it feels like in this environment. Let me see if it's a different environment that might feel differently, right? And maybe it's just the people that I'm working with. And then when I went into this new environment at a new job, I realized, oh, there's some of the same inequalities popping up in this space as well, but it was a little worse than what I had before. And that's when I started to realize that this system is broken. And I found myself in another environment where I was the only Black woman working. And when you're the only of anything, you are going to experience inequalities if you don't have people who are emotionally intelligent and who have done their own internal work to see how we make an environment work for everybody. And in that environment, I started to experience depression, anxiety, a lot of just mental health issues. And that's when I realized that no job is worth my sanity and that I'm going to have to figure out how to not just help myself, but to help others who might also be in a similar situation so that this doesn't become the status quo forever.
You just kind of maybe answered my next question, but I still want to ask and put a pin in it. What is workplace trauma?
Yeah, workplace trauma, it's interesting because when I was going through these things, Amy, I didn't even know I was in trauma, right? I had normalized the experiences I was having as a woman of color, as a Black woman. And so I didn't even know that it was trauma. I just thought, this must just be what it is. And I started to accept it. But I realized any environment where you don't feel safe is going to cause trauma, right? So people who are not showing you dignity, respect, and equity, people who feel like they can dehumanize you at the drop of a dime, right? Then you are going to experience trauma, or you're going to experience post-traumatic stress disorder if you've been in an environment, whether it's work, relationship, friendship, any type of relationship that's causing you to feel like your dignity has been stripped away from you. That is traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
So many people have to stay in their situation because of financial reasons, right? They're supporting themselves or their families. How do you counsel a person who is in a similar situation to the one you were in, who just is in a financial situation they can't get out of?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sam. And I think most people are in those situations, right? We're not in a position to leave. And so I kind of joke around about it in my book, right within, saying, how do you heal while you're in hell, right? How do you figure out how to work this out? Because even in my situation, I was experiencing anxiety and depression, but I couldn't leave. I didn't have enough finances. I was a single woman, like other people were relying on me to help them, so I had all of these responsibilities, and I felt like I could not leave. And so I had to redefine what success looks like in my current situation. And I said, how can I make this environment work for me? So what can I get out of this situation to help me prepare for my next best thing? I've made the decision that I can't stay here forever. I do deserve better. Sometimes we've been in such a bad state that we don't even feel like we deserve a better environment. And so I said, okay, my company has professional development stipends. What certifications can I get? What stretch assignments could I ask for? And so I started to just say, let me turn this on its head a bit and say, let me focus on what I can get out of this, who is supporting me in this environment, and just make a bad situation a little bit better for myself.
So you worked for 4 years while you were building your company, the Memo, on the side.
Yes.
Did you plot out a timeline? Did you think it would take 4 years to fully make that transition?
I didn't know how long it would take, but that was the little bit of space that gave me some hope, right? Because I was experiencing such a bad workplace that building the company allowed me to dream a little bit bigger, to give me a little reprieve from what was going on. And so I was hopeful, Amy. I was working feverishly, hoping that it wouldn't take 4 years, but it did take that long. But it was worth every second, because now I can experience a different situation, and now I can be a role model for somebody else to say, your life doesn't have to end in trauma, right? You don't have to spend your whole working career traumatized.
I mentioned it in the time. I mention it in the time just because, we read so often of female founders, of, best-selling authors like you. And some people think it happens overnight, and it just doesn't. It's so much time.
It takes a lot of time, and I think that's the reality, right? I think a lot of people who don't know my story, or maybe they followed a certain part of it, they think, oh, Minda, this has happened for you so quickly. Yes and no, right? So it's taken a long time, but it took a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to do the, I worked a 80-hour job, and then, built the Memo on the side. And so it was definitely hard to do, but it's not impossible. And I think for our listeners, it's important for people to know that it's possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Will you share a little bit about the Memo for those of our listeners who aren't aware of it?
Yes. So while I was going through a very traumatic situation, I started to think about my story and how I was suffering in silence, and wondering if others might be experiencing this. And the Memo just started as a weekly newsletter called Memo Mondays, and I would write about my experiences. Every Monday I had a mailing list. It probably just started with my mom and my brothers as subscribers, and I thought, let me just continue to do this. So every Monday I would put out a memo about a certain piece of the puzzle. So maybe it's the wage gap, maybe it's about, toxic coworkers. And I just started writing about my experiences. And the more I started writing about them, then I started to find that other women of color were experiencing similar situations, but we never knew how to articulate it, right? We didn't know if we were making these things up. And so the newsletter turned into career boot camps, the boot camps turned into podcasts, and then we just created the suite of services to help women of color in the workplace. And then all those memos that I had been writing for 4 or 5 years ended up turning into the best-selling book, The Memo, What Women of Color Need to Know to Secure a Seat at the Table.
Now, a lot of your clients are now corporate America, ironically, which is must feel at times like a conflict for you, right? You're talking about the problems that are inherent and probably not as quickly changing as you would like, but at the same time, they're the ones writing the checks. How do you manage that?
Yeah, actually, I manage it pretty good, Sam, because I look at it from a different perspective. When I was in corporate America on the other side of the table, I didn't have the influence that I have now, right? So now I sit on a side of the table where I can be honest, where I can be the voice for people who aren't able to use their voices right now. So I actually get to influence corporate America in way better ways and more impactful ways than I could when I was in there on the other side of the table. So now I'm like, okay, I'm actually doing work that actually makes it better for the current generation and the future generation. And I'm talking with the stakeholders. I'm working with C-suite executives, which is something that I didn't have the ear of them, 5 years ago. And so I realize that I actually have even more of a important responsibility to use my voice in the way that I do, so that I can influence these rooms, so that the table can be made more equitable.
When you work with corporate clients, and you're working with the teams that are hiring you, or the C-suite or management levels, and you're working with people who are not women of color, do you recommend that they read the memo and Rights Within?
Absolutely. I say that, how can you help solve for your employees if you don't know about their experiences, right? Two things can be true at the same time. We might work at the same company, but we experience that company very differently. So how can you manage a diverse team if you don't know what your diverse talent is experiencing, right? So reading the memo, reading Right Within will help you be a more, we use the word soft skills, but really to be a more equitable leader. Those are strong skills. Those are leadership skills, right? And so how to have those difficult conversations. And so I think any leader should be reading about the experiences of others, not just themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Are you optimistic? Do you feel like things have changed in the last 5 to 10 years?
You know what? I am very optimistic, actually, because when my book, The Memo, first came out, a lot of companies were like scared to bring me in to talk about it. They're like, this isn't going on here. We don't have this problem, And so they were very scared to talk about race. And so, fast forward in the last 2 years, companies can't get enough of talking about it. And now we can actually solve for racial inequality now that you're acknowledging that it exists, right? So there was a time where we weren't talking about it out loud, and now we are. And you can't solve for what you're not willing to confront, right? And so it doesn't mean we're all racist or sexist or homophobic, but it means that if sexism is here, then racism probably exists here too. Then ageism probably exists here too. So we have to acknowledge that these things exist so that we can create solutions. And now we're talking about those ways to create those equitable solutions. So I'm very optimistic about the future, because we weren't talking about these things even 3 years ago.
How did you first build your audience? I know that your newsletter started with your mom and your brothers, but how did you amass such a big audience? I think that's one of the biggest challenges for entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I sometimes sit and think, Sam, Amy, how did that happen? Because it is kind of crazy. But it really was, I think, vulnerability and transparency. I think I was really talking about a certain thing that was a little taboo, right? And so others started to say, wow, actually that's my experience too, or I've seen that, experienced it, or I'm a manager and I do have people on my team that are Black and brown women. How do I show up for them? And I think I was just talking about things so vulnerably, only because I was hurting at the time, right? And I didn't know any other way to talk about it but to tell the truth. And I think that truth telling and authenticity is really what helped build the audience today.
While you were speaking authentically and vulnerably and talking about a very hard situation, you were still working in a hard situation, and you were doing something that was kind of public. Like, did anybody you work with read the newsletter at the time? Were you afraid of that?
I was. I remember like the year before I ended up leaving my job, we had a staff retreat, and one of my colleagues around the table said, oh, Minda, she had a picture with Michelle Obama like last week. Don't we all want to hear more about that? And I literally wanted to like slide under my table that I was sitting at, because I didn't necessarily want to talk about that right now. And in that moment, I said, I owned it. I said, yeah, I actually work on a business on the side where I'm helping advance women of color in the workplace. And I said it out loud. I owned it. And even my manager, who was causing me a lot of trauma, I said it with him there, and I think people at that time, they were just like, oh, Minda, pat you on the back. That's really great. But they didn't take it seriously. And now the joke is kind of on them, but but I realized that I was a little nervous while building, Amy, but I realized that who's going to be a beneficiary of my courage? I'm a beneficiary of so many women who have come before me, who've made tough choices, who stood in their truth, and I want people to be a beneficiary in my courage. So I'm willing to take this chance to build and still keep my job and go from there. And so I just continued, but I realized that the benefit outweighed the risk.
Where does that courage come from? I mean, your childhood, you grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. I read that your family was earning $25,000 a year at one point. What was your childhood like?
It was a struggle, it definitely was a struggle. But one thing that we had was a lot of love, and when I was in these certain environments, I realized that, I know it might sound kind of like pie in the sky, but love, right? Healing, that respect, that was lacking in all of these different environments. And I realized that I brought so many tools to the workplace that I just wasn't being valued. And my parents always put in me and my brothers the value of self, right? And so I had kind of forgotten it along the way, because I thought that I had to endure that, because I thought that's what corporate America was going to be like for me. But what I realized was I deserved better. I deserved to experience the workplace like my colleagues were experiencing it. And I just remember those things that my parents always taught us about ourself and our self-worth. And so I had to tap back into that. But we grew up very poor. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. And I just realized that I had come so far that I could not lean out and let this dictate the rest of my life. And so I just had to kind of, like Beyonce says, turn, your lemons into lemonade, because I just knew that it was bigger than me.
Mm-hmm. What did your parents do?
You mean, how did they respond to it all, or?
No, I'm sorry. So what profession did your parents work in?
So my father, a majority of my career, my growing up, he was like in janitorial work. And my mom, she would work in like group homes and things like that. And so they had very, I guess, working class professions. And, we grew up on public assistance. And so, I saw all these different things around me. But again, the one thing that I knew was my value. Even if we were, to some poor, we still valued ourselves. And my parents instilled that in each of me and my brothers. And so I just started to remember that again when I was in the pits of the workplace, to say, you know what, I still should be valued. I'm a great employee. And so if I'm not going to get it here, then I need to find a place where I am.
How did you decide to go to college?
It's almost like taboo to say it now, Amy, but it was the Cosby Show, really, because that was the first time I had saw a professional Black family that was thriving, right? And so I'm like, oh, what is the main ingredient? Oh, college. That's exactly what I'm going to do. And I kept that, in my toolkit. And that was the thing. I had no other experience other than seeing them. And I'm thankful that I did see it, because that's the thing that I held on to. And I'm fortunate to have had the insight as a young girl watching that on television to say, I think college is the way that will get me out of this situation.
Did your brothers follow that same path?
They did. And I thought about them too. I wanted them to be able to see it and be able to see it in real time. And so they also too went and got their degrees. And so it's a really beautiful thing.
There's something else I wanted to hit on about your childhood. I read an article where your mom said that when you were young, there was vocational Bible school, and you got on the phone and called up a bunch of businesses to donate and sponsor the Bible school. Like, not many children do that. Like, what led to that? How did you do it?
I was a really resourceful kid. I asked my mom not too long ago, I said, are you surprised by any of this right now? And she said, no, because you've always been a fighter, Minda. When you were born, you were 3 pounds and the umbilical cord wrapped around your neck twice, and you are still here. And she said, so everything that you've done in life is not surprising to me, because it's always been inside of you. She had just told me that story not too recently. And so I'm like, I guess some things are we are born that way in some regards, right? And so I've just always really had inside me to help others. It's just always been something inside of me. And that was very natural for me to hop on the phone and do that when you could pick up a telephone book. So now I'm aging myself.
I want to talk a little bit about microaggressions in the workplace. What is a microaggression?
Yeah, I think that a microaggression, it's easier for me to say it this way. So when I was, one story that I often tell is about a manager, one of my first managers, who I had burnt orange fingernail polish on. And he said, "You people love your bright colors." And he joked around for 15 minutes about Black people liking bright colors. And that is, to some, it could be a micro or a macroaggression. But again, anytime where someone is trying to strip you of your dignity. And I know that some people will say, well, so-and-so didn't mean any harm. Well, they might not have meant any harm, but what is the impact of what they've said on the person that they said it to, right? And I think that that's partially what we have to think about. What are the language that we're using? How are we engaging with people? And if it's stripping them of their dignity or making them feel less than or fearful in their environment, then that is traumatic, and that is a micro or macroaggression. Or what I hope will happen is we'll start to normalize and just say, call it what it is, right? It's sexism, it's racism. Like, I think we wrap these things in pretty bows because it makes it more palatable for people to digest. But at the end of the day, they are homophobia, they are ageism. These are the things that they are.
Mm-hmm. In your new role as an entrepreneur, do you still experience microaggressions?
Oh yeah. They still happen, but now I can decide if I want to address it, if I want to keep working with a client, or if I don't want to work with a client anymore. And it feels good to be able to make those decisions and those choices, but ultimately to also address them. The same fear that I had in corporate America, where some days, most days, I would never address it because I was fearful of losing my job. Now I can have a adult conversation with tools to say, you know what, I know you might not have meant this, but let's have a conversation about that. And it's a learning opportunity, right? And what I hope is if I step up with courage and call it out, that person on the receiving end will be courageous as well, and we can figure out how to make this work. I've had I remember not too long ago, a client called me a colored person, and I was like, I wanted to be like, oh my God, I don't want to do this anymore. But I sat with it for a second. I said, I just want to make you aware that, we're not using that type of language anymore in 2021. And so this is what I would hope you would use and address me or others. And they were very apologetic, right? And it was a lesson learned. They took it. And we moved on, and I continued working with them. They never called me a colored person again. I hope they never use that with somebody else, right? But I think sometimes people don't know, and we have to give them space and grace to have those conversations.
Does it frustrate you that more people don't speak up and don't use their voice?
It's not frustrating because I know right now it's risky sometimes to speak up, right? There is a risk. But I hope that we normalize people having authentic conversations, that there isn't a risk related to that. Because what we know to be true in the workplace is some people can speak their truth and they don't have to worry about losing their jobs. There are plenty of people who, if they're having a disagreement, they say it and they move on without their day. But then there's other marginalized groups that never get to speak their truth. And so oftentimes when I'm talking with leaders, they'll say, well, why didn't a certain woman say that this was a problem? She didn't feel safe enough to tell you that, right? Or she might have been trying to tell you, but you were missing on some of those cues. And so what I'm hopeful is that, each of us, if we all do our work and we learn and grow and listen, that we can have these conversations. And it doesn't mean that we're bad people. It just means that we want to make the workplace better.
How can companies create spaces, rooms, real places where people can have those authentic conversations and not being afraid of being fired? Because you can't do it otherwise.
No, you can't. And I think that, the buzzword is psychological safety. But what we don't often talk about is psychological safety doesn't just happen because we clap our hands and stomp our feet, right? It has to be intentional. We have to create space where people feel safe. In any environment where people don't feel safe, there's going to be trauma there, right? And it's patterns of abuse. And I think that in order for us to do that, we have to, in my opinion, really hone in on our trainings and our coaching. Do our managers and leaders have the tools and competencies to handle conflict resolution, to handle courageous conversations? And I think oftentimes we promote people with not the right competencies to even manage in the first place. So if you've never had any managerial experience, you're not going to be able to have these conversations, right? So I think we really need executive coaching. We need, middle managers to be equipped with conflict resolution tools, because none of this is going to happen if people don't understand how to communicate effectively.
If I could go back and start the riveter over again. So I never had any management experience. Sam, I don't know if you did before you started Park Place Payments, but I didn't have any management experience, and I didn't have executive coaching at the beginning. And so any kind of difficult conversation was something I'd never really been trained to do in the workplace.
Yeah, and most of us aren't, right? I think about early in my management career, I'm sure I've made some people's lives a living hell, right? Not intentionally, but because, I was a star performer here, and of course I could manage 20 people that I've never managed before. And then I realized that, oh, you know what? I need to read some books. I need to get my own training. And I started to do that because a manager really has an opportunity to really grow a person, right? And the experiences that people have with their managers go on to dictate how they show up, if they show their authentic self, if they speak up or not. And so if we all say, you know what, could I be a better manager? What would it take, right? What would better look like? And I think sometimes it's so about ourselves. And to your point, Amy, we take it as an offense to us. And it's like, no, how do we make it better for everybody? Don't we all want it better, right? And I think that that's the piece of the puzzle that's missing when we talk about any type of equity in the workplace.
Well, also, how do we learn to be a great manager, right? Like most of my management skills when I started my first company were from this amazing boss I had named Lucy Woltman, who I'm still close with today, but I was, 22 when I worked for her, and she was just an exceptional manager. And I feel like, having a great manager is really the best thing, right? Like the coaching is secondary, but if you have some great managers as role models, that's kind of the most extraordinary way to learn how to manage. But again, to your point, Minda, I think, you constantly need to be sort of upgrading your management style, because what worked 20 years ago is not necessarily going to work today.
Yeah, you think about it. Many of us have had kind of the Michael Scott manager, right, from The Office, right? So we don't know. We know that that's not what we want to be, but that's who gets promoted, right? So you don't always know. Or you have, kind of the person who just, that's just Tom being Tom, and someone who never addresses conflict, right? And so we see all of these different models, and we take a little bit of them with us into our roles. And to also, some people who were managing, 50 years ago, they're still holding on to some of those tools that worked, 50 years ago. And that's not the workplace we work in anymore.
That's so crazy. I want to pivot a little bit. I have a question. You talk a lot about the workplace and how we can build it and rechange it and reframe it. But what about your personal life? So, Sam and I talk a lot about the importance of friends. We became friends. We've never lived in the same city, but we've grown a deep friendship over the year as adults. Like, who are your friends? Who do you hang out with?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think while I was, healing in hell, and while I was building the Memo, I really lost sense of self in those times, that I didn't really nurture the relationships that I had in the ways that I wanted to. Or when you would go out with your friends, you were going to events, right? And so you don't really get to have that. And I would honestly say it wasn't until probably the last 10 months where I said, you know what, Minda, you are a fun person, but you're not being fun anymore. You do like to do these things. You have a sense of humor, but no one's ever seeing that anymore. And I really had to take a step back and say, let me go hang out with my friends who aren't entrepreneurs. Let me go back and rebuild nurture these relationships, because I do have a life. I want a more balanced type of life, meaning that I don't want everything to just be work related. I want to also have fun and enjoy my life as well. And so it's just in the last several months that I've actually went back to saying, let me have dinners with friends. Let me do these things. And it's been, I feel like I'm 10 years younger, because I'm actually tapping into this part of myself that I've neglected for such a long time.
That's
awesome.
amazing. Yeah. I mean, one of the things I'm wondering is, I think it's so hard sometimes as strong women to find good partners that are not intimidated by your success or your strength. How have you found that in your own romantic life?
It's a hard thing, because I'm actually transitioned out of something and that I was in for a very long time. And I think that the work can get in the way sometimes of that. And if you don't have partners or people who are invested in you the same way that you're invested in them, or that understand that this is a portion of my life, but it's not going to be this way forever, right? And to support you and just root you on, that means so much, right? And so I think for me, I realize more than ever, we talk about love languages, and when I really get down to the root of it, as a partner, I need someone who gives me words of affirmation. I need that support in certain ways, and when you're not getting that, you have to make some difficult choices, just like I've had to make them in the workplace. I've had to make them in relationship too, but I think when we start to cultivate other parts of our life, then what's for us won't miss us, right? So right now I am enjoying a single lifestyle with my fur baby Boston, but I know now that I'm cultivating other areas of my life, so what's for me won't miss me, and so I'm just enjoying all of it now. And as I was telling a friend the other day, we're in a very unique situation. We don't have children, we are thriving in our work. Like, we get to really ride this thing out and enjoy life in a way that we might not have been able to do it 5 years ago. And so I feel a new sense of excitement, and I'm open to dating prospects, and just enjoying that part of my life again.
Sam loves to give dating advice, so.
Well, no, I love the way you talk about your social life, Minda, because it's actually brilliant, right? It's saying, like, I'm going out, I'm seeing friends, I'm giving a large part of my time to my social life, like it deserves. And so that's going to come. And I do believe that. I think that's a great philosophy. I'm a huge fan of that. We are going to go to our speed round now. So we're just going to ask you a few questions, and you can give us just quick answers.
Cool.
What are you reading right now?
I'm actually reading Eve Rodsky, Finding Your Unicorn Space. Yeah.
What are you watching right now?
I'm actually watching Abbot Elementary on ABC. It's actually really funny. It's kind of like The Office, but in a school system setting. Something like that.
Fun. Okay, we'll have to check that
out. What is your nighttime routine?
Well, now that I'm getting older, Amy, my nighttime routine is really taking care of my skin. So I have like all these face regimens that I'm doing, and I'm actually enjoying them. But I recently went to this retreat at Maryville in Arizona, and I bought all these different incense and just really lavenders, and just making sure that I'm calm before I go to bed, so that I'm not ruminating over like stuff that hasn't even happened yet. And so for me, my nighttime is really sacred. I put my phone on silence. I read, I just reflect, and nighttime is really special for me before bed.
If you could wave a magic wand and have one thing happen in your career, what would it be?
I want to be a film producer, so I want to take my books to television.
Awesome.
That's really awesome.
Aim, do a final one.
Okay. Where are you going on vacation when the pandemic is over?
Anywhere. I'll take anything, but I would like to go to Costa Rica. That would be nice.
Wait,
well,
Sam,
Lou has. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
One last one. Sorry, I forgot. Who leaves you starstruck?
Beyonce.
Have you met her?
No, I've been in the same room with her, but I've not met her yet. So I'd like to wave the magic wand for that to happen too.
So Lou Burns has been listening to this entire conversation, and he is going to ask our final question.
Hi, Minda. How you doing today?
Hi, Lou. I like this.
I do too. It was a lot of fun. I've actually been in the same room with Beyonce too, and she's a real freaking light. Like, brightens it up, like huge. I wanted to meet her, but she has a really tall husband, and he don't play. He wasn't letting anybody that shouldn't be around her.
Rightfully
I wanted,
so.
right. I wanted to know more about your childhood and like your high school life and your college life, You seem like a very interesting person, you know, especially the topics that you talk about. But I actually want to know what you're good at besides the stuff that everybody know, like writing books and being an entrepreneur and talking about topics that are taboo. What are you good at that you're not actually pursuing?
I really like to cook, Lou. A lot of people who don't know me outside of like in real life, I do like to cook. I am like a very domesticated person. A lot of people probably wouldn't get that about me, but I love to invite people over. I love to cook. I like to entertain. So that's something that I don't do as often, but I really enjoy cooking. Like I'm one of those people that nerd out on Food Network and then try to like recreate that meal inside my house, you know? So I really do love food. And I think that comes from my dad. He was the cook in our house. And so he was always cooking. And so I definitely love that too. Even in college, I'd be in my dorm room with a George Foreman grill and a hot plate that I shouldn't have had. And people would come in and get food and all kinds of
That's funny.
Yeah. So.
That is funny.
And I love Lou's second question, which was, you know, what were you like in high school?
You know, that's a great question. So I was a little like, I had a lot of friends, but I'd always say that I was friends to a lot of people, but not a lot of people knew me. Right. So I'm one of those people that you might think you know a lot about me, but you don't really know me till you've actually had. So I have that ability to make you feel like you know everything about me, but you really know nothing about me in some ways. And I feel like that probably went through a whole lot of my career. But now I'm realizing that it's okay to let some people get to know you and the different pieces of you. And so, but I always kept a lot of friends around, but and so I was a very social person. But quiet, if that makes sense.
Where do you think that desire for privacy comes from?
Are we turning this into a therapy session?
Yeah.
You know, I think that desire for privacy probably comes from growing up, I think, a little bit poor, you know, I was often around a lot of people with influence, but affluence, but I was, you know, low income. And I think I always wanted to present that I still belonged here too, right? And I think this privacy for not letting people completely know what's behind the scenes. I had one manager that I always would say, let people see your swan on top, even if it's an ugly duck underneath, right? And so always presenting in that way, and so showing up in that way. And so I think that that's part of that privacy, not thinking that people would judge me if they really knew what was underneath the hood. So I think that's part of it. And so I'm unpacking some of those pieces of myself on the internet and in my books and all those things. Yeah.
That's amazing. Thank you, Minda.
Thank you for having me.
This is really fun.
Thank you, Minda. Amy, I found that so interesting, the end piece where she kind of addresses how private she is.
I thought it was really interesting too, and kind of hard to get to, right? I mean, I think being private led discussion about privacy to be hard to get to. And one of the things that was really interesting to me in talking about Minda's family and her childhood is like her parents must be the most remarkable people. I mean, they raised 3 first-generation college graduates. And it's just, I mean, that shows a lot of love, respect, care, just a lot.
It is remarkable. And I wanted so badly to hear even more about her childhood because I bet she has fabulous stories about them and how her family worked and operated. And I want to know the secret to, you know, turning out 3 children who are all so successful and seemingly are all close today and you know, are all thriving in this world.
Yeah, I mean, Minda certainly is thriving, and she's built a really powerful platform, and I feel lucky that we got to talk with her.
I'm excited to see where she goes.
Thanks for listening to What's Her Story with Sam and Amy.
We would appreciate it if you'd leave a review wherever you get your podcast. And of course, connect with us on social media at What's Her Story Podcast.
What's Her Story with Sam and Amy is powered by my company, The Riveter, at theriveter.co, and Sam's company, Park Place Payments, at parkplacepayments.com.
Thanks to our producer, Stacey Para, and our male perspective, Lou Burns.